So this is the Qur'anic discussion. As I said, could it be referring to 2 times in the past, the destruction of Bani Isra'il twice in the past? Could it be referring to something in the future? From a practical, imperative perspective, it doesn't actually matter for how we behave in the circumstances that we have in front of us. So what did the Prophet ﷺ tell us about how this all falls into place at the end? First and foremost, when you look at alamat as-sa'a, at the signs of the Day of Judgment and the end, you see economic warfare. And the Prophet ﷺ said, مَنَعَتِ الْعِرَاقُ دِرْهَمَهَا وَقَفِيزَهَا. That Iraq will withhold its dirham, being its silver currency, and its qafiz, its measure of grain. وَمَنَعَتِ الشَّامُ مُدْيَاهَا وَدِينَارَهَا. That Asham, greater Syria, will withhold its mud, which is a measure of wheat, and its dinar, which is its gold. And the Prophet ﷺ said, وَمَنَعَتْ مِصْرُ إِرْدَبَّهَا وَدِينَارَهَا. And then he said, وَعُدْتُم مِّنْ حَيْثُ بَدَأْتُمْ وَعُدْتُم مِّنْ حَيْثُ بَدَأْتُمْ وَعُدْتُم مِّنْ حَيْثُ بَدَأْتُمْ. He said, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, that as Syria and Iraq and Egypt are put in this crippling situation, he said, you will go back to where you started, you will go back to where you started, you will go back to where you started. And so there is a sign of the land around becoming economically sanctioned, deprived. And economic warfare is at the heart of warfare on the Muslim world. It always has been at the heart of warfare on the Muslim world. It was the case with the Crusaders, who saw an opportunity to open the East for themselves once again. And it's the case for those who see the gas on the shore of Gaza and see dollar signs as well. And I don't need to go any further, but it's the behavior throughout history of how the Muslim world is looked at. So Syria will withhold its dirham, its dinar. Iraq will withhold its currency. Egypt will withhold its currency. There's economic deprivation. And you return to where you started. The scholars mention you return to where you started refers to what the Prophet ﷺ said, that Islam started off as something strange. وَسَيَعُودُ. And it will go back to being gharib, to being strange as it started. And so you go back to where you started in terms of a state of hardship, in terms of a state of weakness, a state of being strange and persecuted once again as an ummah. So there's economic hardship that hits. And then there are wars and political turmoil that hit, and oppression that hit. And the Prophet ﷺ mentions that in this process, تَكُونُ بَيْنَكُمْ وَبَيْنَ بَنِي الْأَصْفَرِ هُدْنَةٌ, that there will be between you and Banu al-Asfar, who are the Romans, a truce. And then he said, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, فَيَغْدِرُونَ بِكُمْ, they will betray you. And he says, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, فَيَسِيرُونَ إِلَيْكُمْ فِي ثَمَانِينَ غَايَةً, and so they will come at you under 80 banners, تَحْتَ كُلِّ غَايَةٍ 12,000. The Prophet ﷺ says that under every banner there will be 12,000 troops. Now if you calculate that, by the way, the idea of nations coming upon you and putting you in a difficult situation, 12,000 troops under 80 banners is not a small number. That's 960,000 troops, right? So you'll be attacked by multiple banners. So the Prophet ﷺ is describing a state of economic desperation. And then he's describing a state of desperation in terms of the numbers, the nations gathered against you. And of course the Prophet ﷺ says in the famous hadith, يُوشِكُ الْأُمَمُ أَن تَدَاعَ عَلَيْكُمْ كَمَا تَدَاعَ الْأَكَلَةُ إِلَىٰ قَصَعَتِهَا. He said ﷺ that the nations will gather to feast upon you, the way that people gather around a table to feast upon their dish. And they asked the Prophet ﷺ, is that because we are qillah? Is that because we are few in numbers? And the Prophet ﷺ says, no, بَلْ أَنْتُمْ يَوْمَئِذٍ كَثِيرٌ. You're a lot of people at that time. The numbers of the Muslims, when you look at the numbers game, it doesn't make sense. And subhanAllah, I want you to just think about this. When you look at the numbers game today, it doesn't actually make sense. Who the oppressors and who the oppressed are, who the powerful and who the powerless are, it actually doesn't make sense from a pure numbers perspective. So he's saying, no, it's not qillah. It's not a smallness of numbers. It's also not necessarily a smallness of means. It's a smallness of purpose. And that's what the Prophet ﷺ mentions, that you will be ghutha, that you will be foam like the foam of the sea. And he mentions that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will remove from your enemy the idea of fear from you. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will put in your hearts al-wahn. And they said, Ya Rasulullah, wa al-wahn? What is al-wahn? And he said, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, hubb ad-dunya wa karahiyat al-maut. You love the world too much and you hate death. And so there's a cowardice that overtakes you as a result. So you're many in number. And you have many nations that are gathered upon you. But you're not outnumbered at any point, and that is not the indication that the Prophet ﷺ gives to us. And then he mentions ﷺ in the state of this affair, and this is why this hadith becomes extremely relevant to the discussion of Palestine. Where he says ﷺ in the hadith of Hudayfa radiallahu anhu, تَكُونُ نُبُوَّةُ فِيكُمْ مَا شَاءَ اللَّهُ أَن تَكُونَ. That prophethood will be amongst you as long as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decrees it to be amongst you. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will remove it once He decrees it to be removed. ثُمَّ تَكُونُ خِلَافَةً عَلَى مِنْهَاجِ النُّبُوَّةِ. And then you will have khilafah amongst you on the way of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And it will be amongst you as long as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decrees. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala removes it from you. Then he mentions that you will have mulkan adda, that you will have a biting kingship. And then he mentions sallallahu alaihi wasallam that will be amongst you for some time. And then you will have mulkan jabriya, that you will have tyranny that will prevail upon you. And then he mentions sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then you will have khilafatan ala minhaj an-nubuwah, khilafah on the way of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he mentions 5 phases sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Just like after economic hardship, you go back to being strange, you go back to being oppressed. Just like here, you go back to the very beginning, as he says sallallahu alaihi wasallam, once again khilafah ala minhaj an-nubuwah. And here you bring in the hadith of Abdullah ibn Hawala radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, who described that the Prophet ﷺ وَضَعَ يَدَهُ عَلَى رَأْسِي, that the Prophet ﷺ put his hand on my head. And he said to me, يَا ابْنَ حَوَالَ إِذَا رَأَيْتَ الْخِلَافَةَ قَدْ نَزَلَتْ أَرْضَ الْمُقَدَّسَةِ. This is why I'm bringing up this hadith. When you see that khilafah has come in the holy land, al-ard al-muqaddasa. And he said, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, فَقَدْ دَنَتِ الزَّلَازِلُ وَالْبَلَابِلُ وَالْأُمُورُ الْعِظَامِ. That at that point you have earthquakes and difficulties, and the most major signs of the Day of Judgment was وَالسَّاعَةُ يَوْمَئِذٍ أَقْرَبُ مِنَ النَّاسِ مِنْ يَدِي هَذِهِ مِنْ رَأْسِكَ. And the hour is closer to you at that time than my hand is to your head. Why do I mention this hadith? Because if you think about the return of righteous leadership, where is righteous leadership going to descend except amongst righteous people? And so while the Prophet ﷺ is talking about al-Ta'if al-Mansura, a righteous group of people that are insisting upon the truth, لا يضرهم من خذلهم ولا من خالفهم, and they're not deterred by those who take them as enemies or those who betray them, isn't it only befitting that when the Prophet ﷺ talks about return of righteous leadership, he talks about it in the same area? And so al-Ta'if al-Mansura, the righteous group, is al-Bayt al-Maqdis, or aknafi Bayt al-Maqdis, as the Prophet ﷺ said, Asqalan, in one hadith in particular, the area of Gaza. The area of Jerusalem is where you have the righteous group, the victorious group. And here the Prophet ﷺ is putting his hand on the head of a sahabi and telling him, when khilafah, righteous leadership, arises once again in that land, then know that you will see something that will come, that will be greater, that comes after. In another hadith from Mu'adh ibn Jabal radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, the Prophet ﷺ said, Umranu Bayt al-Maqdis, kharabu Yathrib. He said ﷺ that the establishment of Jerusalem will be the ruin of Yathrib, or it will be tied to the ruin of Yathrib, which is of course al-Madinah. And he mentioned sallallahu alaihi wasallam that kharabu Yathrib, khuruj al-Malhama, that the destruction of Yathrib is the opening or the beginning of a great war, a great slaughter. And then he mentioned sallallahu alaihi wasallam that after that Malhama comes the opening of Constantinople. And then he mentioned that after the opening of Constantinople comes ad-Dajjal, khuruj ad-Dajjal, the coming of the Antichrist. Now why do I mention this hadith? So Bani Isra'il returns to its old ways. The Muslims are put back into their old ways. Economic sanctions are forced. There are great numbers that are gathered against you. You have to find amongst yourselves as an ummah that unity once again. And the Prophet ﷺ is talking about Khilafa ala minhaj nubuwwah returning. And then here in this hadith, the Prophet ﷺ ties the establishment of Bayt al-Maqdis to the decline in al-Madinah. And he says at the end of the hadith to Mu'adh radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, ثُمَّ ضَرَبَ بِيَدِهِ عَلَى فَخَذِ الَّذِي حَدَّثَ أو مَنْكِبِهِ, that he struck sallallahu alayhi wasallam the thigh that was of Mu'adh radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, and then he said that this is going to happen. إِنَّ هَذَا لَحَقٌّ كَمَا أَنَّكَ هَا هُنَا, that this will happen the same way, that this is as true as you sitting here right in front of me. What's the Prophet ﷺ trying to impress upon one companion when he puts his hand on his head and says, this is as true as my hand on your head? And now when he's talking to Mu'adh radiyallahu anhu, this is as true as you sitting here right in front of me. That this is real, that this is to come, that this will pass, just as what has passed in front of you. So he tied sallallahu alayhi wasallam, Umran Bayt al-Maqdis, the establishment of Jerusalem, the flourishing of Jerusalem, to Kharabu Yathrib, to the destruction or the ruining of Yathrib, which is Medina. And this can refer to either the physical flourishing of a place or the spiritual flourishing of a place. And so if it means the physical flourishing, then it would be referring to what? The occupiers who physically turned Jerusalem into what they turn it into, and its areas into what they turn it into. Right? So if it's referring to the physical, it fits one group of people. If it's referring to the spiritual, it fits another group of people. And there are arguments to be made in both regards. Right? But the fact that the Prophet ﷺ is making a correlation between the two refers to something deeply profound. That there is a time when Jerusalem, if it's being spiritually reestablished, spirituality is leaving al-Madinah. And subhanAllah, the Prophet ﷺ called it Yathrib, which is very uncommon in this hadith, which could be a sign of referring to its spiritual decline. That it's getting away from its original spiritual purpose. And if it's referring to the physical, then it has a connotation as well. And the Prophet ﷺ, of course, he talked about a time in which al-Madinah, يَتْرُكُونَ الْمَدِينَةَ عَلَى خَيْرٍ عَلَى خَيْرِ مَا كَانَتْ, that people will leave Medina in its best state. And he mentioned sallallahu alayhi wasallam that there would be a time where as-sibā' wa-tayr, the only things that would occupy al-Madinah would be wild beasts and birds, and that a dog could walk into the masjid of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam and urinate, and there would be no one there to clean its urination or defecation. Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu was the narrator of that hadith, and this is of course talking about the end of times. He mentioned that it's either evil leadership that runs them away or some sort of disease in one narration. But the point is that Medina is emptied at some point fully. This hadith, the scholars mention, could be referring to a partial kharab, a partial ruin, not the full ruin that comes at the very end of times. So the point is that you have Jerusalem, Umran Bayt al-Maqdis, and you have Kharabu Yathrib are tied together. And then he mentioned sallallahu alayhi wasallam al-Malhama, Malhamat al-Kubra, a great slaughter that will happen. And Malhama is not synonymous, or it's not singular in its usage. So generally speaking, when you look at Akhir al-Zaman, may Allah protect us, the end of times, there are malahim. There are many slaughters, meaning there are times where Muslims are killed in large numbers. But this is, as the Prophet ﷺ mentions, a time in which you have a great slaughter in which many, many Muslims are killed. A huge number of Muslims are killed. And the Prophet ﷺ mentions it as a battle that takes place between the Muslims and the Romans. And the Romans is a more general expression of the Western, world and Europeans and, the Christian world in this regard. So there's some sort of major battle that takes place after a hudna, after a truce that is made that the Prophet ﷺ is referring to. Now we come to, where do we know that Bayt al-Maqdis is freed? Where do we know that it's completely liberated? And as we said, subhanAllah, the opening of Jerusalem has always come through Damascus. that it was through Syria that Palestine is always freed. And so we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that the joy of Syria soon becomes the joy of Palestine as well. That it's always in that direction, historically. When you look at what happens, according to the Prophet ﷺ's description of the end of times, he mentioned ﷺ that in the midst of these malahim, in the midst of these slaughters, that you have a group of believers that flee with al-Mahdi. And al-Mahdi could be what the Prophet ﷺ is talking about when he says the return of a righteous Khalifa. Not necessarily, but it could be that that's Khilafah ala minhaj al-Nubuwwah, that that's the only time that that's actually realized, that hadith becomes realized in the history of Islam after what has transpired so far. But there's a group of people with this righteous leader in the midst of all of this turmoil, all of this chaos. And the Prophet ﷺ says that at that point, Dajjal would have come out and he would have laid siege to a group of Muslims in the mountains of Palestine, in the mountains of Syria. And at that point, as he's laid siege to them, they call upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asking for help. And this is a Ta'if al-Mansura, the righteous saved group of people that stay upon the truth until the end of times. And al-Mahdi, who is leading them at that point, gathers them in Damascus. They escape to Damascus. And while they are in Ash-Sham after a major battle, Shaitan calls out to the Muslims that Dajjal has come for you. صَاحَ فِيهِمُ الشَّيْطَانِ إِنَّ الْمَسِيحَ قَدْ خَلَفَكُمْ فِي أَهْلِكُمْ. That the Dajjal has come out to your families at this point. And so while the Muslims are facing the greatest fitna ever, and while they are in a state of hopelessness, and while they've lost their family members, and while they've run from their homes, and while you have this group of people that are in this situation in al-Masjid al-Umawi, in that particular masjid, this is where, as we said, the time of Fajr comes, and the Prophet ﷺ mentions to us that the Imam goes up to lead. So they make the adhan, they line up, the iqamah is made, and that's when the Prophet ﷺ mentioned the descent of Isa alayhi salam at the white minaret in Damascus, at the east minaret of Damascus. And subhanAllah, that minaret was rebuilt with the wealth of the Christians, as Ibn Kathir says. Why? Because the Crusaders destroyed it, and so it was rebuilt with their wealth. And subhanAllah, Isa alayhi salam descends at that minaret, in that Umayyad masjid that you see on your TV today. And he descends in two yellow dyed garments, in a cream thobe, his hands on the shoulders of two angels, saying, Inni Abdullah, I am Abdullah, the same way that he said when he was born in the courtyard of al-Aqsa, his hair just at his earlobes, dangling and wet and beautiful, just like the Prophet ﷺ saw him on the night of al-Isra wal-Mi'raj, as if he just came out of a shower. And as the iqamah has been made, he walks into the jama'ah, as the Prophet ﷺ said in Syria, فَإِذَا رَأَيْتُمُوهُ فَأَعْرِفُوهُ. So when you see him, know him, he said sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And suddenly, as the Muslims are about to pray Fajr and they notice that Isa alayhi salam has entered upon them and that this was the description of these last moments, everyone is looking at Isa alayhi salam in this feeling of tranquility and in this feeling of being overwhelmed that a major sign has just come amongst them. And the Prophet ﷺ says, كَيْفَ أَنْتُمْ إِذْ نَزَلَ فِيكُمْ ابْنُ مَرْيَمَ وَإِمَامُكُمْ مِنْكُمْ. How will you be when the son of Mary descends upon you and your Imam is from you? Suddenly Isa is amongst you. Everyone is looking at him. Everyone knows who he is. The Imam, al-Mahdi, knows who he is. And then he tells him to lead the prayer. Ya Ruh Allah, taqaddam, salli lana. Pray and lead us in prayer. And Isa alayhi salam says, putting his hand on his chest, taqaddam ant, you should go forth because the salah was called for you. And he prays amongst the Muslims. And then the Prophet ﷺ describes that he stands up with this group of people in Syria that are under siege in that masjid. And he says, Iftahul bab, open the door. And as they open up, a Dajjal is standing there with his followers. And Isa alayhi salam will chase him to where? The gates of al-Lud, which if you look at a map is where Tel Aviv, the area of Tel Aviv would be right there at the gates of al-Lud. And he will chase him to that area and he would say, Inna li fika darba, that I have been commanded to strike you and you will not escape me. And Isa alayhi salam will chase him to the east gates of al-Lud, and there he would start to dissolve at the sight of Isa alayhi salam. But Isa alayhi salam would go to him and would strike him to show the blood of al-Masih al-Dajjal, so that what? To show what a liar he actually was this entire time. That's not like he dissolves and comes back. That this liar was not actually as invincible as you thought he was. He wasn't who he made himself out to be. He claimed to be God. And he is not who he says he was, nor should he be given the weight that he claimed that he should be given. He was never invincible. Which is, subhanAllah, such a powerful lesson, a powerful meaning in that regard. And at this point, and this is where I come to, where Isa alayhi salam comes to the believers, فَيَمْسَحُ عَلَى وُجُوهِهِمْ وَيُخْبِرُهُمْ بِدَرَجَاتِهِمْ بِالْجَنَّةِ. The Prophet ﷺ mentions that he goes to his believers that are with him, and Isa alayhi salam would wipe their faces and would give them the glad tidings of their place in Jannah. هَؤُلَاء هُمْ أَسْعَدُ أَهْلِ الْأَرْضِ يَوْمَئِذٍ. These people are the happiest people on earth on that day. And subhanAllah, as this happens, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tests them with another sign. That Isa alayhi salam will then take his followers to At-Tur, where, if you remember, Allah spoke directly to Musa alayhi salam. And on the night of al-Isra wal-Mi'raj, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam went to that area. And this is where they want to evacuate nafsin wahida, like the death of a single person, wiped out, just like that. And Isa alayhi salam asks for someone to go and to check on them, and he finds that there are rotting corpses everywhere. He makes dua, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends birds that would remove the corpses of Ya'juj and Ma'juj, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends a rain to cleanse the earth, to where it becomes like a mirror, so clean after the blood that has been spilled on that earth. And if you're not seeing the connection, subhanAllah, to what's happened, you're missing it. Isa alayhi salam at that point makes dua for Allah to put the barakah back into the earth, makes dua again. And the earth gives more blessing. The same earth that was covered in destruction and havoc gives more barakah than ever before. And so it starts to have fruits and crops and all sorts of things that sprout from it that were never even known before. And so the earth comes back with greater barakah. And the Prophet ﷺ mentions Tuba lil-Aishi ba'd al-Masih, glad tidings to those who live after al-Masih, Isa alayhi salam. Suddenly, at that point, the people, as he said ﷺ, would eat from a pomegranate, and the peel of it would provide them with shade, that a camel's milk could provide for an entire city, that animals that were predators no longer attack their prey, that money becomes plentiful and poverty becomes eradicated, and there is a certain blessing on this earth, a clarity on this earth that he brings. And subhanAllah, if you look at that courtyard of al-Aqsa today, written on its structures were the ayat of Isa alayhi salam when he came to the earth the first time, when Maryam alayhi salam held him in her arms the first time, and now he's in those same courtyards. And now there's a restoration that has happened on the face of the earth. And there's a hadith that I'll mention here, and I know I'm out of time. The Prophet ﷺ mentioned, لَيُدْرِكَنَّ الْمَسِيحِ مِنْ هَذِهِ الْأُمَّةِ أَقْوَامٍ إِنَّهُمْ لَمِثْلُكُمْ أَوْ خَيْرٌ. He said ﷺ that Isa alayhi salam will find a group of people from this ummah. They are like you, meaning the Sahaba of the Prophet ﷺ, or better. وَلَنْ يُخْزِيَ اللَّهُ أُمَّةً أَنَا أَوَّلُهَا وَالْمَسِيحُ آخِرُهَا. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not disgrace an ummah that I am the first of, and Isa alayhi salam is the last of. When I mention this part, that group of people that's with Isa alayhi salam are compared to the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when you see the images of people today who remind you of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, who bring to life ayat and ahadith and stories that seemed a little bit far-fetched until now where they're so near to you, then it makes sense that this group of people is not accidental, that persevered and that are now standing with Isa alayhi salam in the courtyard of al-Aqsa and receiving the glad tidings of their place in al-Jannah, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala proceeds to revive the earth afterwards. These all could be separate lectures in and of themselves. The period of economic sanction, the Malhama, the disunity of the Ummah, the return of righteous leadership to a righteous group of people, the going back to Syria and the war between the Muslims and a large group of Christians at that point, and all of these things happening, and then the reopening of Jerusalem. All of this could be a chapter in and of itself. But this is not to say anything except that pay attention to the bishara, pay attention to the glad tidings that are presented within. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put in us right now a moment, or put in us a potential to deal with the moment of history that we are in, whether that moment of history is closer to the Day of Judgment than we think, or further from it than we think. We're in a moment of history at this point. And we are to hold on to what inspired the generations before and to seek the reward that they sought without losing sight of the promise that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made to us all, which is freedom and victory in this world and acceptance in the hereafter, should we be those people that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has deemed worthy. And then after it's all done, al-Ard al-Mahshar, the place of assembly. I want you to realize that Ash-Sham is the place that the whole Ummah will go back to. All of us will go to Ash-Sham one day. All of us will return to Ash-Sham one day as al-Ard al-Mahshar. It is the land of assembly. The prophets who lived there and the prophets who longed for it. The believers who were persecuted there and the believers who prayed and protested with them. The hypocrites who ignored them and the tyrants who oppressed them. Those that killed them from afar and those that squashed them from near. Can you imagine how much of the proceedings of the Day of Judgment will surround this piece of earth when every single crusader and every single Zionist who killed and every single person who was complicit and every single traitor and treacherous person will stand before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala one by one to receive their compensation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And every single victim, the named ones and the unnamed ones, the tens of thousands and millions before and the ones today, stand up one by one before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to receive their justice, and the earth itself speaks. The last narration I share with you, what Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala anhu was narrated to have said, تُحْشَرُ الْكَعْبَةُ إِلَى بَيْتِ الْمَقْدِس مُتَعَلِّقًا بِأَسْتَارِهَا كُلُّ مَنْ حَجَّ وَاعْتَمَرَ. That the Kaaba would be resurrected and brought back, would be united with al-Bayt al-Maqdis, with every single person who made Hajj and Umrah hanging on to it. The earth comes back. The holy places come back. There's not just a unification of holy people, but a unification of the holy places, all of it coming together. And on that day, when the Prophet ﷺ mentioned on the authentic hadith, whether this riwayah from Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala anhu is established or not, that the black stone speaks and that Rukn al-Yamani speaks and that the Kaaba, by extension, everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put on this earth is brought forth and resurrected. I want you to realize that no history will be deleted then. And so while these people have destroyed some of the oldest churches in the world, the oldest masjids in the world, the oldest libraries in the world, the oldest universities in the world, the oldest records in the world, that it's in that very same place that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings it all back to testify to that which was destroyed and that which was restored. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us amongst those who restore. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive us for our shortcomings. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us amongst those who fulfill the covenant. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us a people of righteousness who uphold righteousness. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us worthy of His promise. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to liberate al-Aqsa, to bring ease to its people. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us from its people. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that as we have read and studied the virtues of al-Bayt al-Maqdis, that we remember that in al-arda la tuqaddisu ahada, that the earth does not make anyone holy, that Allah make us holy so we are worthy of a holy land. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to be resurrected on the side of the people of Gaza on the Day of Judgment, to allow us to be resurrected with the people who are on the right side of this, and not to be amongst those who are punished for their shortcomings and for their disobedience on that day. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to remove from us the private sins and the public sins that bring hardship upon our ummah and that cause our du'as to not be elevated. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to alleviate the suffering from the ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam all over the world, in Ash-Sham and beyond. Allahumma ameen. Jazakum Allahu khairan wa sallallahu wa sallam baraka nabina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.